The end bursts forth as a beginning. The open field, once anonymous on the edge of the forest, is filled with sirens that cut through the twilight and splash the scene with red and blue reflections. The dust suspended in the air mixes with the metallic smell of dried blood and oil from the patrol cars. Reporters line up cameras, microphones, and cables over the damp mud. Onlookers squeeze behind the yellow tape. Environmental protection agents give silent orders. In the center, two paramedics carry a small stretcher from the narrow trail leading from the forest. A small body, covered in a thermal blanket, shivers with cold and exhaustion. A makeshift cradle of leaves is still attached to the child's legs, as if the forest itself had tried to protect it. Beside it, restrained by nets and at a safe distance of 4 men, a chimpanzee watches unblinkingly. Its chest vibrates rapidly. Its calloused hands bear recent marks of struggle. In its eyes there is something that breaks the barrier of instinct. Attentive vigilance, silent possession, a pact. Cameras zoom in as the rescue team reveals the marks of the trap. The crowd's collective jaws tighten. Hooks, metal, steel teeth crooked from desperate effort. The object is lifted high by a police officer, and the murmur spreads like wind through dry grass. Appearing on the screen, between hurried news clips and portal headlines, is the sentence that crosses borders. Chimpanzee finds human baby trapped in trap. His action moves the entire world. The phrase isn't a headline. It's an observation recorded by multiple lenses. 3 drones hover overhead. Birds flee the propellers. The sun falls behind the tall canopy, transforming everything into a silhouette of light and shadow. The animal tries to move forward as the stretcher passes. The agents steady their feet. The taut nets form an elastic arc, and the collective weight prevents any momentum. The chimpanzee stops. Its body tilts, as if measuring the last possible distance between what it protected and what is being carried away. It inhales, exhales, listens. The child's faint cry travels through the crowded corridor and finds the attentive ear that has accompanied it for hours and perhaps days. The animal's gaze responds, not violently, but with that slight nod that recognizes a familiar sound and authorizes it to leave. The paramedics accelerate, disappearing between ambulances. Doors slam. The engine starts. A nurse raises her hand with her thumb as a sign of clinical stability. People applaud. Some cry. Others film. And many simply breathe, as if returning to the surface after too long underwater. The news stitches together the present with fragments of records. Grainy cell phone footage shows a basket of leaves being hurriedly woven. Another recording captures a chimpanzee warding off vultures with sudden swoops. A third video reveals the semicircular trail of repeated footsteps around the trap, like a guard perimeter. The public narrative takes shape instantly. An unlikely guardian stopping beside a human life, when everyone believed the danger came from him. Common sense searches for explanations. Hunger, curiosity, chance, but the succession of evidence dismantles easy labels. There are scratches on the trees indicating lookout climbs. Rocks clustered in front of the metal, as if a boundary had been drawn. Broken branches arched over the child's body, protection from the early morning rain. At the containment perimeter, technicians assess the animal. Its fur is covered in dried mud, pollen, and tiny flakes of rust. Its collarbones show the tension of someone pulling levers that won't budge. Its scraped palms tell the unlabeled story of repeated attempts. It stops when a metallic clang echoes from the truck carrying the seized trap. It turns its face and follows the object until it disappears, not out of fear, but as if confirming the threat has been removed from the territory. The air cools quickly. The spotlights compete with the remaining natural light for the clearing's contours, and time seems to expand at the precise pace the crowd realizes what they've witnessed. Not an attack, but a vigil. The repercussions grow in real time. Messages explode on screens. Hashtags pile up. Commentators set up emergency discussion panels. Experts are rushed to explain the inexplicable. Interspecies cooperation, spontaneous empathy, primate social intelligence, protective behavior when faced with a baby crying, even if it's not their own species. Children watch silently in their living rooms. Adults replay the video, and the elderly wipe away tears, recalling other rescues from their lifetimes. The word commotion, so overused in headlines, suddenly seems too small for the context of what's being spread. Meanwhile, in the field, a decision must be made. The chimpanzee, without resistance, accepts the isolation ward designed for stressed animals. There is no surrender, only exhaustion. His breathing slows. His torso relaxes for brief moments. His eyelids grow heavy and quickly react to any movement in the direction where they took the child. No one calls him a threat anymore. Technicians whisper procedures. Police take statements. The previously suspicious residents maintain a respectful distance. A biologist points out drag marks around the site and describes the protective trail that carried leaves and fibers to form that sort of crib. Another technician collects strands of human tissue clinging to the metal, traces of the child's clothing, signs that he's been trapped for too long. The vehicles depart in groups. The last images capture the animal silhouetted against the light, fixed, with its head slightly tilted to the side of the road. Nothing about it begs, nothing about it threatens. There is only an invisible line stretched between two beings that no longer share the same space, but still breathe in the same rhythm. The world will have time for interpretations, narrative disputes, studies, and tributes. The forest, however, preserves essentially simple tracks. Circular footsteps, broken branches, piled up stones, the deep mark of a body crouched for hours at the foot of a danger that was incompatible with the life it protected. The question then arises like a clapperboard. How did they get there? The scene is set, the pieces are visible, but the story remains suspended in the instant after the rescue, demanding cause, course, and consequence. The narrator collects the final scene and folds it as if it were an old photograph, preparing for the necessary dive. On the other side of the yellow tape, in the shadows between the city and the forest, an arrow of text writes itself in the imagination of the viewer, 12 hours earlier. The morning before the chaos began as usual, with the forest breathing in slow cycles and the village repeating ancient gestures. Heat rose from the beaten earth, chickens scratched the yard, and coffee smoke drew arabesques on the low kitchen roof. Children chased a deflated ball, dogs stretched in the shade of the delivery truck, and the community radio blared warnings of light rain in the evening. Nothing on the surface suggested disruption. The air held that compact normalcy that keeps life moving even when invisible tension already throbs beneath the skin of the place. A few kilometers away, in the green interior where the light filters in sheets, the group of chimpanzees followed their morning routine. Females rummaged through leaves, young chimpanzees chased shadows, and the older male circled with discreet attention, as if reading the edges of a map. It was a cohesive group, marked by learned routes and safe havens, a social organism made of silent exchanges and alternating vigilance. The water ran clear in the stream, squirrel monkeys cut through the canopy in short leaps, and the distant sound of chainsaws came and went like a stubborn hum. The border between human and wild was there, porous, continually crossed by sounds and needs. In the village, the plot's players moved without knowing their roles. There was the family who would discover the disappearance too late. There was the forest ranger who had learned to measure the trails with his eyes. There was the biologist who collected field notebooks and patience. There were the hunters who treated the forest as both a dispensation and a challenge. There were also attentive neighbors and others who were indifferent. Normalcy united them in an almost calm choreography. They shared fruit, sold milk, adjusted antennas, postponed decisions. Everywhere, small signs piled up without finding an interpreter. A child played near the gate. An old trap remained forgotten under leaves. An inspection notice circulated late. A secondary trail received new footprints. The trigger came without a special sound. A brief distraction, a gate ajar, an innocent invitation to curiosity. The child disappeared from the supervision radius as if slipping off the edge of a painting, and her absence only became apparent when eyes searched for her and failed to find her. First, the family called out naturally, certain she would emerge from the neighboring yard or from behind the tree by the well. Then they expanded the perimeter, wandered down alleys, and consulted friends. The clock ticked forward with the cruel slowness of someone testing their nerves, and as afternoon began to fall over the red clay, normalcy gave way to an urgency that scratched the throat. The village was then divided between those who mobilized instinctively and those who preferred to believe it would resolve itself. Meanwhile, in the forest, the first strange signs were already altering the behavior of the chimpanzee group. The old male stopped collecting, stared eastward, sniffed the air, and followed in an oblique line, retracing a trail not on the day's itinerary. The youngsters followed him for a few meters, but were stopped by a brief gesture that established priority and danger. The silence around them had the density of an announcement. At a certain point, the smell of rusted iron rose from the ground like a harsh warning, and broken branches betrayed the haste of a large animal or careless person. The old man took 2 steps back, surveyed the surroundings, and advanced with the caution of someone carrying the entire group on their fingertips. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't a territorial dispute. It was a diffuse call the species can read when a baby cries. At the edge of the forest, news of the disappearance passed through filters of denial. Some suggested the child had hidden as a joke. Some blamed the parents' distraction. Some blamed childhood curiosity. Some recalled old stories of animal attacks, told as legends on nights with a full moon. The forest ranger quickly gathered volunteers, distributed flashlights, and asked them to travel in pairs. The biologist brought trail maps, explained that prohibited traps were often left in transition areas, and insisted that no one advance uncoordinated. An older man laughed at the caution, another downplayed the risk, and a third cited the monkey's supposed cunning. Small, compounded resistance delayed mobilization in the minutes that defined destinations. Details that would only make sense later began to emerge in everyone's field of vision, but were dismissed as noise. A puppy barked insistently into the woods and was restrained so as not to disturb them. A boy reported hearing a cry that sounded neither like a cat nor a bird, and the adults sent him home. A hunter noticed the absence of an old trap he swore he had disarmed weeks earlier and blamed vandals. A resident commented that, since dawn, vultures had been circling low in an area that rarely attracted carrion. The ranger jotted down each piece in a sweaty notebook, trying to piece together a coherent mosaic as the sun slipped behind the trees. When the first flashlights came on, the contrast between the window-lit village and the twilight-swallowed forest became clear. The false peace, however, still clung to the rhetoric of those who preferred to postpone panic. One group stayed on the road, another walked along the edge of the stream, and a third followed the hunter's trail. The biologist repeated that small children rarely move in a straight line, drawing tight circles, returning to landmarks, but the teams had already been swallowed up by different paths, guided by attachments and intuitions. In the heart of the forest, the old chimpanzee crossed the invisible threshold where routine ends and instinct takes over. The human cry finally emerged as an unmistakable signal, intermittent, thin, interspersed with short breaths. The metal of the trap was obscured by leaves and mud, and the cruel pattern of the steel teeth cut the gloom into hard lines. The child trembled, his small body emitting heat and fear, and the sour smell of rust mixed with freshly scratched skin saturated the air. The animal stopped at a safe distance, calculated the radius of the scratches, pushed aside thorny branches with his forearm, and tested the vibration of the structure with his hand. Around him, the forest receded slightly, as if making room for an act that still had no name. In the village, the clock ticked to the moment when denial became unbearable. Gates were closed, lights were turned on, promises were made in silence, and the search took on the contours of a mission. The forest ranger requested support over shortwave radio. The city council activated civil defense, and the first patrol cars departed. Some voices insisted on the hypothesis of an attack, others on voluntary disappearance. Amidst this noise, a small, stubborn certainty grew. Something was wrong in the interface between the last houses and the first row of trees. The chapter closes at the exact point where the false peace finally gives way. The village enters the night with bated breath. The forest becomes a labyrinth of reflections and shadows, and two trajectories begin to converge, that of those who search out of obligation and fear, and that of those who have already found it through instinct and care. Everything that was at stake before the chaos is finally revealed, not as disposable noise, but as a map of signs that the present ignored. The next dawn will bring the truth to light, but now what matters is the transition. The moment when the everyday shatters and the moral awakening begins, silent, determined, irreversible. Dawn crept in, cold and slow, and the forest breathed a different rhythm. Dew fell heavily on the leaf-covered ground, and the sound of insects seemed to whisper intermittently, as if nature were observing something it shouldn't yet interfere with. In the heart of that green labyrinth, the chimpanzee remained motionless beside the child. His body formed a protective arch, his trunk curved over the small human body, his eyes alert to every movement in the forest. The trap, twisted from the effort, still had its iron teeth embedded in a small, swollen leg. Dry blood had mixed with the earth, turning the ground into a dark carpet. For hours, the animal tried to free her. He pulled the locks, struck the chains with rocks, ripped out vines, and used branches as levers. When the noise attracted predators, he roared and faced the danger, warding off foxes and vultures with broad, violent gestures. None of his attempts were enough, but none were in vain. Time, then, ceased to be a human measure. It became resistance. Dawn found the chimpanzee exhausted but vigilant, his body covered in mud and cuts, his chest rising and falling at increasingly slower intervals. In the village, the search parties returned to the rendezvous point. Some men, sweaty and irritated, claimed to have seen something big moving among the trees. One swore he heard screams and ghoulish laughter, mistaking the echo for imagination. Others mentioned shadows, footprints, and the sound of branches breaking. Fear began to fill the gaps left by uncertainty. Rumors arose that an animal had taken the child, and the name of the chimpanzee, known for appearing near farms, was mentioned with suspicion. The following hours were dominated by denial. It was easier to pinpoint the culprit than to accept blame for the forgotten trap, the negligence, the waiting. Panic grew like embers fanned by the wind. Hunters gathered weapons, vowing to protect the village. The forest ranger tried to stop the group, reminding them that no attack had been confirmed. The tension split into two camps, those seeking revenge and those seeking reason. In the midst of this, the biologist, still incredulous, insisted that the signs didn't point to aggression, but to something more complex, something protective. Few listened to him. Back in the forest, the chimpanzee noticed the men approaching. The sound of footsteps and voices echoed through the trees. He slowly stood up and looked around, assessing escape routes. The semi-conscious child moved an arm, and that was enough for him to kneel again. The priority was clear, not to abandon them. The forest began to fill with artificial lights, flashlights, and makeshift spotlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The metallic sounds of weapons echoed, and the air smelled of gunpowder, sweat, and fear. The first visual contact was brief. One of the hunters, shining a light on a stretch of land ahead, saw the chimpanzee crouching. The cry of "There he is!" echoed loudly. The men ran. The animal raised its body, opened its arms in an instinctive gesture, and took a step back, keeping itself between them and the baby. To human eyes, that posture was a threat. To those who understand instinct, it was protection. But no one wanted to understand. A shot rang through the air, striking a nearby tree trunk. The sound reverberated like thunder. Birds took flight in flocks, and the chimpanzee roared, not in fury, but in despair. The child cried, and the sound chilled even the most brutal. For a moment, no one moved. The beam of a flashlight revealed the small human body trapped in the trap. The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone understood in a split second what they were seeing. The denial, until then comfortable, began to unravel. The ranger ran, dropped to his knees beside the trap, examined the wound, and realized the baby was still breathing. The others, stunned, recoiled in shock. The chimpanzee, not understanding the men's new behavior, remained alert, not retreating too far, ready to react if the child were threatened again. The biologist, panting, arrived last and knelt, surveying the scene with teary eyes. He recognized the pattern of the rocks arranged around the trap, the arch of leaves, the fingerprints in the mud. Nothing there spoke of a predator. Everything spoke of caution. The men stood motionless, overcome with guilt. The idea of a dangerous animal crumbled before the physical evidence of compassion. Still, part of them was reluctant to accept the obvious. They needed a narrative to absolve them, and denial returned in the form of doubt. It was a coincidence. It could have been worse. Maybe he was just curious. None of them wanted to admit the humanity of that gesture. The infant was carefully removed. When the trap gave way, the chimpanzee stepped forward, carefully observing every movement. The guard ordered no one to shoot, and silence remained. The baby was wrapped in a blanket, and the team began their return. The animal followed them for a few meters, then stopped. Its gaze followed the stretcher until it disappeared among the trees. Then, as if fulfilling an ancient mission, it sat on the leaf-covered ground and remained there, observing the emptiness left behind. When the flashlights faded, the forest resumed the sound of crickets and water. The chimpanzee lowered his head, placed his hands on his chest, and took a deep breath, as if feeling the weight of a bitter victory. The cameras, hastily installed by volunteers, captured the moment. The video would be shared hours later, and the images would change the course of history. In the village, denial persisted, now mixed with shame. No one wanted to be the first to admit their mistake, but everyone knew. The villain they imagined was the hero who had sustained life when everyone else had failed. The truth, though still fragmented, was beginning to become indisputable. The protagonist's isolation was complete. The misunderstood chimpanzee had saved a child and lost his freedom. And in that silence between the last echo of human footsteps and the first ray of sunlight, the forest held proof that even instinct can be more compassionate than human judgment. The mask of ignorance was still in place, but it was beginning to crack. The world would soon know what had truly happened, and the animal's name would cease to be synonymous with fear and become a symbol of a miracle. The next morning dawned heavy, with the sky covered in low clouds and the air filled with the rumor of what had happened in the forest. The village awoke before the sun. Journalists, authorities, curious onlookers, and experts mingled on the dirt streets as if the place had become the center of the world. The baby, already on the way to the hospital, struggled between life and unconsciousness. The chimpanzee, meanwhile, had been located and surrounded by an environmental protection team, isolated within a makeshift perimeter of metal screens. What was supposed to be just a rescue report turned into a worldwide spectacle. At first, news chaos reigned. Some versions claimed the animal had attacked and then regretted it. Others described it as an unpredictable beast. But images captured by drones and cell phones began to circulate. In them, the chimpanzee was seen sitting next to the baby, warding off vultures, covering its body with leaves, and maintaining constant vigilance. Its behavior was methodical, protective, almost human. Each frame dismantled the narrative of danger and revealed another, more disturbing one, that of the instinct for care where humans expected savagery. The biologist, who had witnessed the rescue, became the first ally in the animal's defense. He spent the early morning writing a report and compiling evidence, photos, footprint analyses, and behavioral pattern comparisons. The document demonstrated that the trap had been set by human hands and that, instead of aggression, there were clear signs of an attempted release. The next morning, he took the report to the environmental police and journalists. At first, it was ignored. Those responsible wanted to close the case quickly, without complications that would question the authorities' actions or the negligence of local hunters. But the truth found its way out. A video leaked by a volunteer showed a close-up of the chimpanzee trying to break the chains with a rock. The footage went viral, racking up millions of views in just a few hours. Public outrage grew. On social media, people demanded justice, called for the animal's release, and condemned illegal hunting. The chimpanzee's name, until then just one among many in the forest, gained a symbolic title, the Guardian. Meanwhile, in the village, the mood was divided between shame and tension. Some residents began to hide, fearing punishment. Others tried to clear their image, claiming they had no knowledge of the trap. The presence of cameras and reporters exposed contradictions. The forest ranger, under pressure, confessed to having warned the city hall weeks earlier about the increase in illegal traps, but no one had paid any attention. The biologist, now with international backing, returned to the forest to collect new evidence. He discovered marks on the ground indicating that the chimpanzee had made several trips back and forth, carrying leaves and fruit, trying to feed the baby. Each new detail reinforced the same conclusion. It was no coincidence. An official investigation was opened. Environmental police teams searched nearby houses and found several traps similar to the one used in the incident in a local hunter's shed. The man was detained but denied responsibility, claiming someone could have used the equipment without his consent. When questioned about the area where the trap had been set, he hesitated, and that hesitation was enough. Word spread, and the public turned its fury against him. But not everyone was on the side of truth. Among the biologist's allies, a traitor emerged. A city hall employee, tasked with liaising with environmental agencies, began passing distorted information to the press, attempting to downplay human negligence and restore the image of local authorities. He created a false narrative that the animal had lured the baby with noises, manipulating the environment. This absurdity resonated with those who needed an excuse to avoid feeling guilty. Tensions rose as a rescue team attempted to transfer the chimpanzee to a rehabilitation center. Along the way, a crowd gathered, some to applaud, others to protest. The atmosphere descended into chaos. A rock was thrown at the truck. Another man, driven by ignorance, tried to open the cage to dispense justice. The guards had to intervene. The frightened animal screamed and clung to the bars. The scene, filmed on dozens of cell phones, traveled around the world in seconds. It was impossible to watch without feeling uncomfortable, the rescuer being treated like a criminal. That same day, a new report confirmed what the biologist had been saying all along. The impressions in the mud showed that the chimpanzee had remained next to the trap for at least 40 hours. Fragments of leaves and branches lined up in a protective manner clearly demonstrated the intention of shelter. There was no longer any doubt. The villain's mask had fallen, and the unlikely hero had revealed himself. The reversal, however, took on human dimensions. One of the hunters, overcome with remorse, confessed to having set the trap and forgotten to deactivate it. He said he never imagined it could harm a child. His voice trembled. The recorded testimony ended the last vestige of collective denial. The error was not nature's, it was man's. That night, the biologist was invited to speak on national television. His calm voice echoed across the country. There is more humanity in that animal than in many who judged him. The words echoed deeply. At the sanctuary where the chimpanzee now rested, cameras captured an unexpected moment. He sat by the fence, looked at the horizon, and raised his head toward the distant sound of sirens, the same sound that accompanied the rescue. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. The escalation was reaching its peak. The truth was asserting itself with the force of evidence, and those who had previously pointed their guns now lowered their eyes. But the story wasn't over yet. The world demanded an answer, not just about what happened in that forest, but about what the chimpanzee's gesture said about the human condition itself. The final piece of destiny was beginning to move, and the stage for the final confrontation was already set. The sun was rising pale as the truck transporting the chimpanzee drove through the sanctuary gates. The silence inside the vehicle contrasted with the tumult outside. Journalists, volunteers, and curious people crowded before the fence, vying for images of the man now called the guardian of the forest. The cameras captured every detail: the animal's weary gaze, the biologist's dirt-stained uniforms, the logos of the environmental organizations that suddenly seemed to be vying for prominence. But inside, amid the noise of the crowds and the distant sound of cicadas, there was only a panting breath, that of a living being who didn't understand fame, only the duty that had brought him there. The sanctuary had prepared a secluded space, surrounded by tall trees, where the chimpanzee could recover. As soon as the cage was opened, he hesitated. A brief moment, a glance at the ground, and then at the sky, as if searching for reference. Then, you took the first step. Your body, marked by wounds, met the damp ground, and the wind touched your face as a silent acknowledgement of the partial freedom that was returning. No fury, no rush, just the stillness of someone who carries within them the echo of something that transformed the world. Meanwhile, the news was already crossing borders. On television and in newspapers, the case was treated as a natural miracle, living proof of interspecies empathy. Schools showed the rescue video as a lesson in compassion. Scientists analyzed the animal's gestures, explaining the behavior as an expression of social intelligence. But ordinary people saw something greater. They saw love. The phrase, "the chimpanzee who saved a human baby," had become a global symbol. Days later, the great confrontation came, not of bodies but of truths. In an auditorium packed with cameras, local authorities were called to account. The biologist presented the evidence again, calmly and firmly. Satellite images, forensic reports, footprint records, and even laboratory tests confirmed what was already clear. The tragedy was the result of human negligence. The hunter responsible for the trap apologized on camera, his voice choked and his face clouded with regret. Across the table, the forest ranger watched silently, aware that his insistence on acting quickly had saved 2 lives, the babies and the animals. The masks had fallen completely. The public, previously thirsty for blame, now found itself confronted with its own collective guilt. Those who hunted out of habit began to rethink. Families began to close their properties to illegal hunting. Children began writing letters to the sanctuary, sending drawings and messages to the hero of the forest. The entire country suddenly seemed to awaken to a truth that had always been before their eyes. Compassion knows no species boundaries. In the second half of the story, consequences and catharsis arrived. The baby, after weeks of recovery, was discharged. Doctors called him a miracle. When the camera showed him for the first time, healthy, smiling in his mother's arms, the country stopped. The image was displayed next to the chimpanzee's photo in a split frame, as if they shared the same destiny. The scene moved the world, and the sanctuary began receiving donations from every continent. The biologist returned to the forest, now escorted by volunteers and researchers. The trap site had become a memorial marked by a simple plaque. Here, human life was protected by hands that were not human. The ground had already absorbed the rusted iron remains, and in the place of the former clearing, a new tree, planted by the village children, grew. At the sanctuary, the chimpanzee remained silent. Recovered from his injuries, he spent his days observing the movements of the people outside the fence. He showed neither fear nor joy, just an ancient serenity. One spring afternoon, something unexpected happened. A family arrived, accompanied by reporters and guards. Among them, the baby, now flushed with curious eyes, looked toward the enclosure. The animal recognized him immediately. He moved slowly, approached the bars, and sat in front of the child. No words, no sudden gestures, just 2 glances that met through the air and understood each other without sound. Time stood still for a few seconds, and everyone who witnessed that moment felt the same. Life, somehow, was apologizing for having doubted nature itself. The story ended there, with the simplicity of a gesture and the immensity of its meaning. The sun set behind the mountains, gilding the outline of the cage and the child's face. A light wind blew through the space between them, stirring up leaves and dust. The chimpanzee lifted his face and took a deep breath, as if finally able to rest. Months later, a documentary would immortalize the episode, chronicling the rescue, the investigation, and the change it sparked. The final line would echo across screens around the world. The truth always comes out, and sometimes it comes from the hands of those who will never learn to lie. The village, the forest, and the sanctuary continued their rhythms. But the echo of that encounter remained, reminding everyone that compassion is the oldest language on earth, and that, in the heart of silence, even a wounded animal can teach what it means to be truly human.